Chapter 25, The United States in World War II. December 1941, after Japan attacks the United States at Pearl Harbor, the United States finally enters the war. A president and a country now must mobilize a depressed, peacetime country for war. The United States must now produce workers, soldiers, weapons, and equipment that will help to win the war. In this chapter, we're going to learn to understand the military campaigns, the political decisions, and efforts on the home front to help win World War II. In the first section, Mobilizing for Defense, we'll try to see and explain how the United States expanded its armed forces in World War II, try to describe the wartime mobilization of industry, labor, and science, and try to trace how the efforts of the government to control the economy in World War II. So in this first section, Americans joined the war effort. What was the Selective Service System, and how did it help the United States meet the manpower? Well, the Selective Service System, very similar to what took place in World War I, is going to expand the draft and provide another 10 million soldiers to meet the need of armed forces. Right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, close to 5 million men and young boys are going to volunteer to serve. Yet it still wasn't enough to send and defend democracy in the Pacific and across the Atlantic. The contributions that women and minorities made were also very extraordinary, yet had some difficulty and sadness to it too. The military's workforce needs were so great that the Army Chief of Staff, his name was General George Marshall, is going to push for the formation of a Women's Auxiliary Corps, known as WACS. Under this bill, women volunteers would serve in non-combat positions. In July of '43, after thousands of women had enlisted, these WACs would serve as nurses, ambulance drivers, radio operators, electricians, and pilots, nearly every duty not involving combat. Yet, as far as minorities are concerned, despite discrimination in the military, for many of these minority groups, a large number will join the armed forces. These soldiers would mostly, in the beginning anyway, live and work in segregated units and were limited mostly to non-combat roles as well. After much protest, especially for African Americans, they finally would see combat near the end of the war. Even Japanese Americans are going to join and try to remember that a lot of these Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps in California. But you're still going to see a large number of them, about 33,000, that join the U.S. Armed Forces and will serve as spies and interpreters in the Pacific War. A production miracle. How did American industry contribute to the war effort? Well, probably one of the biggest successes here is how factories were converted to war production. Kind of similar to how a lot of factories have been kind of asked to take on making masks and ventilators and things like that in the country as well as around the world. Kind of doing the same thing. So auto plants like Ford and Chrysler these were huge plants that had the capacity to now make tanks, planes, boats, command cars, things like that. Um, the government didn't have to quickly build companies or factories to do this. In fact, part of the deal was, Ford, Chrysler, stop making cars and now make these. And they're going to get paid by the government to do this. Another example is companies that made mechanical pencils, mostly for draftsmen or architects, engineers, now used their facility to make bomb parts. Soft drink companies use their assembly lines to fill shells with explosives. And so this was a part of how the government had to work with American industry to now produce what it was going to have to do. As in World War I, shipyards became extremely important to not only protect, but to get making ships faster than ever before. And again, they're going to utilize that prefabricated system where these factory-made parts are then shipped to these shipyards, and they can assemble these ships and submarines very, very quickly. The picture on the right, bottom right, I just want to draw your attention to is, of course, a submarine. That submarine was made in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Continuing with the production miracle, how did the war create new job opportunities for women and minorities? Well, obviously, with so many men volunteering and being drafted into the war, there is a huge need for workers. And many women are going to fill that need. And as women showed that they could endure factory work, they were hired. And this is where we get, and I should have put the picture up here, a poster of Rosie the Riveter, but that's kind of where that comes from. Minorities across the country, especially African Americans, were also used and are going to fill a lot of these jobs. Most of them, unfortunately, some mostly menial jobs or tasks, but there's going to be kind of another migration of Black workers, African Americans, to a lot of war factories in the North and in the West. Science also helps with the war effort. Roosevelt quickly realizes that in a sense, they have to kind of outsmart the enemy. He's going to create the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Some of the advances that they'll make will make improvements to radar and sonar, which becomes so important. The use of pesticides are quickly developed to try to fight insects, specifically in the Western campaign in the Pacific. And of course, the miracle drug, the development of penicillin. And that miracle drug is going to stop the infection rate something big time in World War II, saving the lives of just countless millions. And probably the most, again, significant scientific effort is going to be probably the best kept secret of the entire war, at least during the war, the Manhattan Project, where the United States now develops, with science and military, they put together the atom bomb. So the government needs to kind of step in and take control here. And so how did the federal government act to control the economy? Well, one of the first things it will do is create what's called the Office of Price Administration. It will fight inflating prices by freezing prices on most goods. Again, what happens during wartime is that there's such a high demand of certain things, prices go up. You're starting to see that now with certain things too, such as meat or toilet paper. You're starting to see those prices start to inflate because there's such a high demand for it. Water, by the way, has gone up a little bit too, bottled water and things like that. Congress also raises the income tax rate. And not only do they raise the income tax rate, they expand the income tax. And so it's going to now extend to millions who have never paid it before, in reality, what that does is it means that even though they're going to raise income tax, they don't have to raise it as high as they thought, because it kind of covers a wider umbrella now of people. Higher tax started to reduce demand on certain scarce goods, which meant that now they had less to actually kind of spend, though, too. They also encouraged the purchase of war bonds with extra cash. War bonds, remember, are kind of those IOUs that the government give us the cash now, we'll pay you the cash later with interest. The War Protection Board also ensured that armed forces and war industries received the resources they needed to win the war. So you had nationwide drives to collect scrap metal, aluminum, and things of that nature. The War Production Board was also in charge of making these contracts with companies, making sure that they would get a profit no matter what. Cost plus is what that was referred to as. Continuing on the government taking control, how did its actions affect everyday life? Well, in World War II, unlike World War I, World War II will see a rationing system set up. And so households received a ration book, very similar to kind of what you see on the upper right there, except you had coupons that came with it that you used so that you didn't get more than what you were supposed to. Gas was also rationed. In the bottom right, you can also see that even sugar was rationed and its purpose. And of course, interestingly, most American citizens did not protest this. They accepted it as a way to help win the war. And obviously, like human nature, some cheated the system. They'll hoard scarce goods and then sell it, kind of profiteering a little bit. And of course, the black market is going to find items as well, or steal them and then sell them so that the government can't catch them. We live in a sin-filled world, and our sinful minds sometimes look for ways of looking out for me, myself, and I. And this obviously is a situation where that takes place. In section 2, the war for Europe and North Africa, we'll try to summarize the Allies' plan for winning the war, obviously, and identify events in the war in Europe, as well as liberation of Europe. So let's take a look at what did Roosevelt and Churchill agree to very early in the war. Well, it's sometimes referred to as the ABC agreement. They had to save Europe first. And so they had to get the upper hand in Europe. It was kind of a holding situation in the Pacific. It's not that they weren't going to send troops there and fight. They just, more resources were going to go and save Europe first. They couldn't afford to let Hitler take Europe. Otherwise, Hitler and Germany get a hold of all of England's resources, and that would have been a huge turning point. The Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic really refers to the sea battles that all take place in controlling the Atlantic River for getting the supplies from the United States to Great Britain and eventually the Soviet Union. They relied on things from the United States now. That was kind of a lifeline for them. And as in World War I, that convoy system is going to be especially helpful. Use of sonar and radar now will help increase the United States' success in getting merchant ships as well as transport ships and troops over to Europe. U-boat losses eventually start to increase over Germany's production. We're talking about German U-boats, and that becomes very detrimental to Germany there. And by 1943, this is what's amazing about American ingenuity here. The United States is producing about 140 ships a month. Keep in mind, a lot of those kind of get knocked out of the water each month too, but the fact that they're able to keep producing here is phenomenal. The Eastern Front in the Mediterranean, we'll talk first of all about on the Eastern Front, the Battle of Stalingrad. What ends up happening is that Hitler is going to kind of go against an agreement with Stalin and attack the Soviet Union. It was brilliant at first, but Hitler kind of blows it as he stops listening to his generals, you might say. Doesn't think it's as bad as what they're saying, and he should have listened to his generals. But it was a three-pronged attack. They were going after Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. Stalingrad's in this kind of more the southeast, not too far from the Ukraine. And there are oil fields there, and there are coal mines. So it's a very, very, very important industrial center as well for the Soviet Union. It also bears Stalin's name, and so that becomes kind of important too. They're going to defend it for the sake of Stalin. This is one of the most unbelievable stories, to me anyway, on the Eastern Front. Stalin will not let the citizens of Stalingrad leave. They are forced at gunpoint to stay and defend the city with the military there. And of course, Stalin, when he takes over, he kind of eliminates a lot of the high command of the Soviet Union because he feared they would try to take over. So they're hurting big time, not only in production of goods, not only in trained soldiers, but trained officers is the other thing. Eventually, what happens is that the Germans will attack and kind of surround Stalingrad, and things look really good for Germany at first. But this takes longer than what it should, and that helps the Soviet Union, and it hurts Germany because Germany's getting pretty far away from their supply line. And again, Hitler kind of refuses to surrender here. Finally, that'll happen, but mostly to save or hope to save many of the German soldiers that will surrender there. Some of the problems, probably the biggest problem for Germany, is that a bad winter sets in, and it sets in sooner than expected as well, and it kind of catches them off guard a little bit. And it allows the Soviet Union to kind of counterattack and then surround them. And so eventually what happens is that Germany is just not getting supplies. It's not getting replacements. A lot of that is kind of stemming back to Hitler just kind of getting mad at his commanders here and not believing that they can't get this stuff. It marks a huge turning point in the war because now the Soviet Union can start advancing towards Germany on the Eastern Front. That's huge. But just in Stalingrad alone, look at that stat down below. They will lose 1,100,000 soldiers and probably civilians as well, more than all American deaths in the war. It's just an unbelievable bloodbath in Stalingrad. The Eastern Front in North Africa and the Mediterranean, what happens here? This is actually where the United States starts. When it gets it in and it heads over to Europe, this is where it starts. They head to kind of North Africa, and you can kind of see on the map on the right, upper right there. They'll join England and invade kind of the Axis-controlled North Africa, commanded by Eisenhower. Part of the reason they do this first is the United States doesn't really think they have enough troops to invade Europe. So they kind of attack in an area where they know that Germany is not as concentrated as they are perhaps in Europe. They will chase what's called the Afrika Korps. The Afrika Korps is led by the guy in the bottom right there, General Rommel, sometimes referred to as the Desert Fox. By May 1943 in Tunisia, they will eventually surrender, and Rommel, of course, sneaks off to Europe. So that's what happens there. What happened after the Allies invaded Italy? Well, first of all, North Africa. Again, Stalin is hoping that the other allied, England and America, the other allies to the Soviet Union, they'll attack Germany on the Western Front in Europe to take off some of the pressure on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. But again, America is still kind of concerned that they're not quite ready for that yet. So instead, what they do is they make a plan to kind of attack Germany from its, you might say, soft underbelly. And so that soft underbelly is Italy. So in the summer of 43, they make their campaign towards Italy. They'll capture Sicily, which, if you can see on the map, is kind of out in the Mediterranean there. The Italian government in this time also finally kind of gets Mussolini, and they'll strip him of his power, forcing his resignation. And in all honesty, the Italians kind of thought, with Mussolini out of power, they were done. The war was over for them. The only thing is, Hitler was not going to stop and just let the Americans or the Allied forces take Italy. And so, determined to stop the Allies in Italy before they could reach Germany, he sends amazing resistance into Italy. And this is some of the bloodiest fighting in World War II in Europe. Success in Italy, if you look at the start was in the summer of 43, it's going to take till 1945. Interestingly, too, you have a lot of minority units that fight and help fight in Italy. And this is, of course, where the Tuskegee Airmen, on the lower right there, in the cool leather jackets there, flight jackets, the 99th Pursuit Squadron makes a name for themselves. Can't remember exactly how many missions these guys fly, and like never lose a plane. So really very impressive, very impressive. D-Day. Here's the Allies finally. This is their plan to invade France and free Western Europe, alleviating the pressure on the Eastern Front with Stalin. Stalin's probably jumping for joy here. It's known as Operation Overlord, an Allied force of nearly 3 million. Eisenhower creates kind of a phantom army to try to keep it a secret and divert German forces and the German command from figuring out where they were going to do it. Germany knows this is going to happen. It's just a matter of where. And so they kind of plan in several different places. I think even might have been Rommel, but one of these guys even picked Normandy as the spot. And Hitler just refused to listen because he didn't like the guy. So June 6, 1944, one of the biggest problems was weather, preventing it from happening any sooner. But they finally go June 6, 1944. Largest land, sea, and air operation in Army history. Unfortunately, the German retaliation is extremely brutal. And not only is this an attack on the land, but this is also kind of a new plan of using an airborne division, the 101st Airborne and others, that get dropped off on the other side, more inland, to try to put the squeeze to the German force here. German retaliation, again, very brutal. And by September, though, from June to September 44, they finally reach Paris, and France is liberated. The Battle of the Bulge. As Allied forces continue to move west towards Germany, Hitler orders a last kind of ditch effort to try to disrupt supply lines and make it to Antwerp, where that was a major supply hub for the Allied forces. And so German tanks are going to break through a very weak defensive line, pushing a 60-mile bulge into the Allied territory that you can see on the map there, with kind of led by an elite German troop, which kind of massacres a number of GIs. And if you look on the map too, you notice a little circle. It's the city of Bastogne. Becomes kind of a famous part of the Battle of the Bulge. as the 101st Airborne is there, and they refuse to surrender, and they defend that you might say little area in that circle. And just an amazing story. And most of it's done in the winter, as you can see in the picture in the lower right there. So for about a month, it looks as if Germany's going to make this push. But the First Army from the north and the Third Army, Patton's guys from the south, pretty much squeeze in and kind of force their retreat. And the Western Front continues to move closer and closer to Germany. What did they find when they finally got to Germany? Unfortunately, as will the Soviets, they'll discover some of these Nazi death camps. The picture on the right, you've got Patton. He's got the kind of the helmet on in the center there, and he's just to the right of Dwight D. Eisenhower, kind of in the hat there. Those guys wanted themselves to be part of some of these pictures because they didn't think the world would ever believe their story or believe that was true. What happens to Hitler? He wrote his last address to the German people, blaming, of course, the Jews and his generals. Then he kind of hunkers down in his bunker. His wife, new bride, is going to end up taking poison, and he ends up shooting himself. And of course, he gave orders to have both their bodies soaked in gasoline and burned so they would never ever be able to find remains of Hitler. Sadly, FDR also dies in April 12th of this year, 1945, prior to peace in Europe. The picture on the lower right there of him, that is kind of the final painting that was being done of FDR. Huge story behind this, but this is where he kind of has a stroke and dies.